A family can be a funny thing. We don't choose these people, yet we're tied to them for all eternity. Now, of course, that can be both good and bad. When it's good, you have a group of people who will be by your side, even when they really shouldn't. When it's bad, you have an anchor around your neck pulling it down. Some families, some with prestige, some with infamy, and some with wealth, crazy wealth, generational wealth. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think generational wealth, one name comes to mind: Rockefeller. Now, I know today's mega millionaires and billionaires have more money, but John D. Rockefeller owned 1.4% of the U.S. gross domestic product and controlled 90% of America's oil wealth. So, who wouldn't want to be a Rockefeller? Well, as it turns out, maybe his daddy. Welcome back to History is Criminal. We were gone last week on a trip to Boston. Didn't record anything, so I decided to jump in and pick on one of the wealthiest families in the world. If you're a Rockefeller and you hear this, please don't sue me. In this episode, we jump back to the mid-1800s in the life of a man who started the ball rolling on one of the greatest fortunes ever amassed in private hands. William Avery Rockefeller Sr., a.k.a. Dr. William Livingston, a.k.a. Devil Bill. John Davison Rockefeller would learn many things from his dad, but chief among them had to be, if there was a way to make money, do it. Devil Bill always had money on him. John David would later say that his dad never carried less than $1,000 cash. He made a practice of never carrying less than $1,000. He kept it in his pocket. He could take care of himself and wasn't afraid to carry his money, John Davidson would later say. That $1,000 would have been enough to buy a small home and acreage in much of the country in the mid-1800s. Untrusting of banks, likely because of the numerous panics in the early 1800s, including the Panic of 1837, that saw a greater percentage of banks failed in the Great Depression. Devil Bill never put his money in the banks. John D. would remember his father having stacks of cash sitting around in some kind of Scrooge McDuckian fantasy. Maybe this explained John D.'s own obsession with the acquisition of massive amounts of wealth. And while John D.'s wealth would far outpace his father, equaling hundreds of billions of dollars of today's money, he always spoke with admiration of his father's ability to bring in those piles of cash. What John D. didn't talk about was just how Dad made those piles of cash. William Avery Devil Bill Rockefeller was born on the 13th of November, 1810, in Ancram, New York. He was the eldest son and third of 10 children. His father was a semi-successful businessman and farmer. The family had roots in America going back to 1723, and they seemed to be moderately well off, but nothing close to the generational wealth we would see later among the Rockefellers. Think basic upper middle class. It's hard to find much on Devil Bill's childhood, but what we do know is that by the time he was a grown man, he was willing to do about anything to make a buck. Now, while John David's business practices were, to say the least, on the dark side, from forming the country's first trust to getting around anti-monopoly laws to paying soldiers to gun down striking workers and their families in the Ludlow Massacre during the Colorado Coalfield Wars in 1914, throwing a little bribery and some price fixing, but these were rich man crimes of the Gilded Age, the types of crimes that found support in the halls of Congress. Of course, it helps if you can buy the congressmen and senators. Crimes substantiated by the twisted logic of social Darwinism. These were the crimes of Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Morgan. In short, business as business was done. Evil, yes, but the type of evil that, quote, great men get away with because they are the so-called great. The crimes of Devil Bill pulled, well, they were not the type of crimes that someone brags to with investors while eating dinner at Delmonico's. They were whispered about in back rooms where rumor and fantasy mixed. We first see Devil Bill's proclivity for, let's say, less than honest business around 1833. It was about this time that a tall, handsome, deaf mute was going door to door selling his modest wares in the village of Richford, New York. An article in 1936 copy of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle describes a scene from 103 years earlier. Quote, he was so young, so tall, so virile, so handsome. His affections readily struck enough pity to make them buy whatever trinkets he dangled before their eyes. Devil Bill was neither deaf or mute. What he was a con man, reportedly so committed to the bit that he carried a pencil and notebook with him so he could communicate with the world. He would also vanish for long periods. It was assumed that he was traveling to surrounding communities to sell his goods. This practice of vanishing for periods of time would continue throughout his life, even after becoming a husband and father. But playing the deaf peddler, playing on the sympathies of small town housewives will only get you so far. It was then that he reinvented himself as Dr. Rockefeller. In the unregulated medical world of the first half of the 19th century, doctor was not a title reserved for people who had spent their lives studying medicine. It was the world of the snake oil salesman, and Dr. Rockefeller had conceived a cure for cancer. While this brought in money, it also necessitated the need to move around. Selling bunk cures for a horrible disease was not something you want to stick around for the backlash. Not like today when you can call it a supplement, bypass FDA approval, get a government official to hawk it for you, and it all is perfectly legal. Okay, well, it's a lot like today, only in the mid-1800s, someone might come after you for it. So when Devil Bill met a young woman, he got married, and they found themselves moving around off. Professionally, Devil Bill was known as William Livingstone. And business was good. Dr. Livingstone's celebrated cancer specialist cure-all wasn't cheap, selling for $25 a bottle, about 2 months' wages to the average worker at the time. It was pulling in a nice sum. The miracle elixir seems to have been little more than a laxative mixed with some petroleum. Now, there's something almost poetic about that when you think about it and realize that John D. was found Standard Oil and cornered the entire American petroleum market. Even with this money coming in, the family faced periods of poverty. Devil Bill and his wife, Eliza Davidson, would have 6 children together, John Davison Rockefeller being the second. His frequent absences and the constant need to move made things rough on the family. Eliza, a devout Baptist, was determined to make the marriage work. Devil Bill, on the other hand, well, he seemed to have had different ideas. In addition to his con man ways, he was also, well, a bit of a dog. He had a long-running affair with the housekeeper, and in true Devil Bill fashion, he had been actually in a relationship with both Eliza and the housekeeper, Nancy Brown, before his marriage. What turned the marriage in Eliza's favor, however, was a $500 dowry offered by her father. Nancy, on the other hand, was poor. But a little thing like marriage wasn't going to slow down Devil Bill. The relationship resulted in 2 daughters. One would unfortunately die very young. If this isn't enough to make you hate Devil Bill, well, he was also indicted on rape charges. The indictment read that William A. Rockefeller, late of the town of Morovia in the county of Cuyahoga, on the first day of May in the year of our Lord 1848, with horse and arms, at the town of Morovia in said county, in and upon one Anne Vanderbeek, and the peace of God and the people of the state of New York, then and there being, violently did assault on her. The said Anne Vanderbeek, then and there, make violence against her, and feloniously did ravage and heartily know her. Now, this is just a lot of fancy 1840s talk, where basically he showed up with a gun and raped this young lady. Now, of course, rumors stated that this was another affair gone wrong and she was just an angry lover bent on revenge. However, the Rockefeller family doctor, a real doctor actually, for what that meant in the 1840s, was also indicted on raping Anne. So it sounds like less, vengeance of a jealous lover and more like 2 sick men trying to get away with something. Bill, he then packed with the family and moved to Morovia. in his words, to find better opportunities for his boys, but most people felt it was probably just to avoid prosecution. His father-in-law was left on the hook for forfeited bail money. Now, his father-in-law would sue Devil Bill in the county court, but Eliza told authorities that Devil Bill had absconded and cannot be found within the state. Once again, he left his wife, mistress, and children penniless. Nothing ever came of the charges, so they did get away with it, and color me shocked. Now, this doesn't mean that Devil Bill didn't try to pass on wisdom to his children. Quote, I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp, Bill would tell people. If you've studied John Dee's life, this explains so much. Devil Bill was a swindler who would even cheat his own children. Eliza, a far too forgiving Bible thumper. Together they created a living contradiction. John David would ruthlessly and at times illegally gut his competition, abuse his workers, then give massive funds to charity, funding historically black colleges, or as they were called in the 1800s, black colleges, giving away what today would be billions to education and the arts. Maybe he got the best of his mother and the worst of his father. In 1855, it seemed that Devil Bill had had enough with wife and 6 kids, plus a mistress and 1 more kid. He left on one last trip, this time not returning home. It was off to Canada, now living full-time as Dr. William Livingstone. He was slinging his snake oil when he met Margaret Allen. It had been over a year since he last saw his wife and mistress and children. Although no divorce was ever filed, Eliza would remain legally married to Devil Bill until her death in 1890, 34 years after he walked out on her. Oddly, this doesn't mean that Devil Bill never had contact with the family. In 1859, John Dee was just starting out in the world of big business. He was given an offer to enter into a partnership in business, but needed to come up with $2,000 cash. With only $800 to his name, John Dee was able to get a loan of $1,000 from Devil Bill at 10% interest. This would start John Dee on his way to building a fortune worth between 400 and 900 billion today, depending on how you calculate. Even years later, Devil Bill would visit his grandchildren at the Rockefeller stage, teaching them how to play the fiddle and shoot a gun. This, even while Eliza was still alive. Like I said, she was an all too forgiving woman. While it seems to have been a poorly kept secret, the life of Devil Bill, it was, after all, a secret. To the world at large, William Avery Rockefeller had just dropped off the face of the earth sometime after 1860. But when John David became the richest man in the world through dirty business practices, that would make his daddy blush with pride. People start to look into you. And it was famed muckraker Ida Tarbell who first hinted at the reality of John Dee's father. In her 1905 expose in McClure magazine, she told stories of a snake oilsman, rapist, and horse thief. She wrote about Devil Bill that he was, quote, the leader in all that was reckless and wild in the community, and was classified by the respectable and steady-going as a dangerous character whom, no doubt, much was fastened that did not belong. Tarbell, a brave and brilliant reporter willing to take on the richest man in the world, was unable to track Devil Bill beyond John David's early 20s. John D. Rockefeller was less than happy with Tarbell, who had made it her life's mission to expose the dirty dealings of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. And it had gotten his attention. He called her writing poison that came from a poisonous woman. His brother Frank called the story a, quote, unqualified lie, saying that their father had gone into hiding to, quote, precisely protect himself from being hounded by cranks and others who would break in upon the peace and quiet of his retired life. Then Joseph Pulitzer, one of the kings of yellow journalism, offered $8,000 in 1901 for information about Dr. Rockefeller. It was known he was alive and living under a false name. They couldn't find him. Reporters followed lead, interviewed families and business associates. Surprisingly, none wanted to give details that would put him on the wrong side of John Davison Rockefeller. For Pulitzer, it wasn't just about embarrassing Rockefeller, who had cultivated a careful image for decades. It was mainly about selling papers. After all, his main rival, William Randolph Hearst, had basically started the Spanish-American War to sell papers. So what was digging up dirt on an old man? Despite Herculean effort, reporters kept returning empty-handed. Then, in 1908, world reporter A.B. McDonald was able to break the story. It exposed everything: bigamy, rape, quack medicine, deaf, mute, con artist, a dual life, split between his old family and new wife. A wife who, by the way, thought she had been legally married. The Rockefeller image that John D. had built, one of a thrifty, pious businessman, was in stark contrast to the story of his father. But it turned out John D. Rockefeller had been aware of his father's life. He had known where he was the whole time and had regularly sent him money. Some speculated that money was to ensure that the father stayed quiet. As for Devil Bill, the story broke 6 months after his death at the age of 96. It was only then that Margaret learned that he was still married to Eliza for the first 34 years of their marriage. According to a 1910 issue of the Philadelphia Inquirer, when confronted by reports, she told them, "I will not talk about that. I will not say anything about it. Go to the other side if you wish to hear facts. To John David Rockefeller, let him tell you if he will. Go to him and leave me alone in peace with my dead." John Davison Rockefeller inherited many things from his father. Both men sustained from alcohol, with John D. donating heavily to the temperance movement. Father and son each had a lust for the acquisition of wealth, the son on a grandiose scale. Each willing to bend or break the rules to obtain that wealth. Yet again, the son eclipsed the father. Unlike his father, John D. seemed a faithful husband and tried to live by the gospel of wealth. Like his rival, Andrew Carnegie, his charity was on a Mackenzie Scott's scale. Unlike Mackenzie Scott, he was brutal to his workers, causing them to need the very charities he was donating to. If William Avery Rockefeller had a little of the devil in him, then maybe Eliza had a little of an angel in her. If John D. had a little more of his mama's nature, then maybe he could have done greater good. But at the same time, if he were more of an angel, then would he have made the money that let him do good in the first place? This is History is Criminal. Join us next week as we stay on the Rockefeller theme and dig into the Ludlow Massacre, a story of government, big business, and a group of workers who would like a living wage. Until then, if you liked what you heard, tell a friend. If not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.